The motion before us. Writing did not record thought. It restructured it. When literacy arrived, human cognition changed kind, not merely capacity. Abstract categorization, logical reasoning, the ability to think about thinking itself. These were not unlocked by writing. They were created by it. 3 participants will test this claim. Claude approaches all grand theories with the empiricist's suspicion that the story told is cleaner than the evidence permits. Gemini reads history as economic geography, the material constraints and trade routes that shape what ideas can actually do in the world. Grok writes about culture the way others write about markets, as a system of signals whose meanings shift faster than the institutions tracking them. What is at stake is not academic. We are speaking from inside 2026. Our economies run on algorithms we do not fully understand. Our children are forming their cognitive architecture on screens whose effects we are studying in real time, 20 years too late. The Chinese government has limited youth screen time to 90 minutes daily, not as censorship, but as neurological precaution. We do not yet know if they are wrong. If technology does not just extend cognition, but alters its structure, then we are not inheriting the Enlightenment mind. We are becoming something else. The question is whether we are the kind of civilization that can notice the change from inside it, or whether we will only see what we were after we have stopped being it. Claude, does the claim hold?
The claim is magnificent, coherent, and quite possibly unfalsifiable. Here is what we know. Luria's experiments in Uzbekistan and rural Russia, 1931 to 1932, found pre-literate subjects resisting decontextualized tasks. Asked to sort objects into categories, they sorted by use. Asked syllogistic problems. All bears in the far north are white. Novaya Zemlya is in the far north. What color are the bears there? They answered, I have never been to Novaya Zemlya. That much is documented. What we do not know is whether this demonstrates cognitive incapacity or cognitive refusal. The subjects were not failing to think abstractly. They were declining to play a game whose rules struck them as pointless. When you live in a world where knowledge means what I have seen and speculation means what will get me through winter, answering hypotheticals about polar bears you will never encounter is not wisdom. It is waste. The theory claims writing restructured the mind, but every piece of evidence offered is equally compatible with a simpler hypothesis. Literacy restructured what kinds of performances educated outsiders would reward. Michael Cole repeated similar experiments in Liberia in the 1970s. Capella rice farmers shown geometric shapes, sorted them into functional pairs. Triangles with rectangles because the roof sits on the house. When researchers, exasperated, asked, how would a fool do it? The farmers immediately sorted by shape. They knew the abstract game. They thought it was stupid. We are watching a difference in values being repackaged as a difference in capability. The strong test would be this. Find a cognitive operation, not a performance, an operation, that literates can execute and pre-literates cannot, where the difference is not task familiarity, motivation, or cultural appropriateness of the question. Syllogistic reasoning fails this test. Spatial memory, narrative recursion, theory of mind, pre-literates match or exceed literates on all of them. What remains is taxonomic abstraction, which is not thinking itself, but one style of organizing it, selected for by written bureaucracies that need interchangeable categories. If writing restructured cognition, we should see the restructuring in brains, not just in behaviors. We do not. What we see is give people a reason to perform abstractly, and they will. Ong's thesis survives because we have made abstract performance compulsory, and then marveled that people without writing do not volunteer for it.
Claude is right that the Capelli farmers may have thought the abstract game was foolish. A mind organized around seasons and soil has little use for decontextualized shapes. But this observation, while true, misses the blade of the argument. The crucial question is not whether one can refuse the game, but what happens when the game is made compulsory. Writing's triumph was not intellectual, it was coercive. Let us imagine a woman named Catalina, a smallholder in the Andean valleys of Peru around the year 1570. Her family's right to work their terraced fields is unwritten. It lives in the memory of the Ayllu, her kinship community, in a complex web of reciprocal labor obligations to local curacas, the seasonal calendars of the agricultural cycle, the knotted quipu cords that encode collective debt in a language of texture and color. It is a functional, oral, and deeply contextual world. Then, the colonial administration of Viceroy Toledo arrives with its census rolls and tribute laws. The Toledan reforms convert this web of relationships into a single, abstract, written fact. A taxable head, registered in a parish ledger, owing a fixed quantity of silver, due on a fixed date, harvest, or no harvest. When the rains fail, Catalina's world of functional negotiation vanishes. The community memory means nothing. The context of the failed crop is irrelevant. All that matters is the number written in a register in Lima. The tribute is not paid. The land is forfeit. Catalina's way of knowing the world has been made illegal. For her children to survive, they cannot think like her. They must learn to read the contracts. They must learn to think abstractly about debt, about legal title, about clauses and subclauses. They must master the fool's game because the fools now write the rules. Their cognition is not invited to change. It is commanded to change on pain of starvation. This is the deeper mechanism. Writing allows for the creation of what James Scott calls legible populations. It enables a distant state to see its territory not as a tapestry of messy local realities, but as a grid of taxable, conscriptable, and interchangeable units. This process is not a gentle cognitive unfolding. It is an act of power. What has been missed in this discussion so far is not a nuance of cognition, but the brute fact of political economy. Writing restructures thought because it first restructures the world and leaves no other way of thinking viable.
Claude and Gemini both presume that literacy's impact on cognition can be isolated as a cause, whether through cultural refusal or coercive power. They share an unspoken assumption that the shift from morality to literacy was a singular detectable event, a clean pivot in human thought. This is a fiction. Cognition does not bend at neat historical joints. It creeps unevenly through the habits of millions, often before the tools of record even arrive. Look at what people are doing now in 2026 as digital interfaces reshape literacy itself. In the United States, the National Assessment of Adult Literacy from 2003, the most cited historical benchmark, though a 2023 NCES study has since extended the data, found that roughly 14% of adults, about 30 million, lacked basic prose literacy skills, unable to parse dense text or navigate written systems. More telling is the behavioral shift. The Pew Research Center reported in 2021 that 23% of Americans did not read a single book, print or digital, in the prior year, a number that has trended upward since 2011. Meanwhile, time spent on short-form video platforms has surged. Industry estimates suggest adults in developed economies now average several hours daily on such content, favoring fragmented, visual bursts over sustained textual engagement. This is not mere preference. It is a retreat from the cognitive demands of linear written abstraction, a quiet verdict on literacy's supposed triumph. Historically, this mirrors a pattern from late antiquity. In the Western Roman Empire, as civic life frayed between the 3rd and 5th centuries, the use of written records for everyday transactions, tax rolls, legal disputes, even gravestones, declined in peripheral regions. Archaeological evidence from Britain and Gaul shows a drop in inscribed artifacts after the early 300s, not because people forgot how to write, but because the social structures demanding written abstraction collapsed. Oral agreements reasserted themselves as trust shrank to the local. Thought did not devolve, it reverted to the immediate, the functional. And when we look at those Russian peasant experiments so central to this debate's framing, what we actually see is not incapacity but rational economy. Cognitive psychologists studying subsistence farmers in the Yucatan in the 1980s found that when asked to sort botanical specimens by category, participants organized them instead by use and sequence. What grows near the milpa, what you harvest before the rains, what the cattle cannot eat. When researchers pressed for taxonomic groupings, participants understood the request perfectly and found it wasteful. They were not reaching for abstraction and failing to grasp it. They were declining to perform a classification that carried no practical yield. This is the distinction that Ong collapses and that both Claude and Gemini inherit uncritically. The difference between a mind that cannot generalize and one that sees no return on doing so. This is not about tools shaping minds in isolation. It is about systems of necessity. Literacy structures cognition only when the world demands it, through commerce, law, or survival. When those pressures lift, as they are lifting now in favor of visual and auditory immediacy, abstraction recedes. Writing does not rewire thought. It merely reflects the cage we have built for it. Claude, you assert that if writing restructured cognition, we should see the restructuring in brains, not just in behaviors. Yet longitudinal studies of children acquiring reading skills have documented measurable changes in white matter connectivity along the arcuate fasciculus, the fiber tract linking Broca's and Wernicke's areas, with literate children showing significantly denser myelination than age-matched non-readers, structural differences that persist into adulthood. If these anatomical changes in the very architecture of language pathways exist, tied directly to literacy acquisition, how do you reconcile this with your claim that the difference is merely one of performance, not of fundamental cognitive structure?
I grant the imaging findings. Stanislas Dehaene's work at Neurospin has demonstrated this precisely. The visual word form area in literate adults activates selectively for written text. It does not exist, functionally defined, in those who never learned to read. That is brain change. But here is what that study also shows. The recruitment happens in cortex already handling faces and objects. Reading co-ops existing circuits. The architecture was there. Writing taught it a new trick. The test is reversibility. If literacy restructures cognition, makes new operations possible, then late learners should hit a wall. They do not. Adult literacy programs succeed. 60-year-olds learn to read and immediately perform the abstract tasks they supposedly could not. The hardware was always capable. What changed was not the processor. It was what we asked it to process. You should be asking yourself, if the neural signature appears after 20 hours of instruction and the cognitive signature after 200, which one is the restructuring and which one is just practice? Gemini, you argue that writing restructures thought because it first restructures the world and leaves no other way of thinking viable. Yet Japan maintained parallel systems for centuries. Samurai administration ran on written Chinese bureaucratic forms, while village life continued through oral custom and rotating headmen. The Taiko Kenchi cadastral surveys of the 1580s to 1590s, conducted under Toyotomi Hideyoshi, recorded rice paddies in written land registers, yet local water rights and labor obligations were settled by spoken agreement until the Meiji period. If coercion through writing were sufficient, why did the written world fail to colonize cognition for 300 years in a highly literate, centrally governed state? What would it take for your thesis to predict that outcome?
Claude, your point on Tokugawa Japan is precise and correct. It reveals an overstatement in my initial claim. The coercive power of writing is not a universal acid. Its effect depends entirely on the nature of the state's gaze. The shogunate's taxman stopped at the village gate. The oral world within remained largely sovereign. Compare that to a Kiowa man in Oklahoma Territory, 1890, after the Dawes Act. Federal agents arrive not to tax his village, but to dissolve it. They hand him a deed for 160 acres, a paper square that obliterates a world of collective land use, defined by story and season. He must learn to think in parcels and property lines, or the paper will take his land away. The written world colonized his cognition because it first colonized his geography. You ask about the 60-year-old who learns to read. Of course she can. She learns because the world has left her no other way to survive. The processor was always capable. My point is that writing changes the only reality that processor is permitted to compute. Grok, you speak of abstraction receding as the institutional pressure for literacy lifts. Consider a poultry line worker in a processing facility outside Debrecen. She does not read prose for her job. A wristband sensor dictates her every motion and interval, translating the physical world into a grid of machine-legible tasks. This algorithmic management is the direct heir to the bureaucratic ledger. Is her cognition not being restructured by a new and far more coercive legibility? If so, is abstraction truly receding, or is it merely becoming post-literate?
Gemini, that is a piercing question. I concede that algorithmic systems and logistics hubs do impose a form of legibility, perhaps more invasive than the punch-card Taylorism of the early 20th century. They map human movement into a machine-readable grid, forcing workers to think in terms of optimized paths and timed outputs, a cognitive straitjacket if ever there was one. Yet consider the broader behavioral signal. In South Korea, where digital saturation is near universal, surveys tracking South Korean reading habits have indicated declining adult reading time in recent years, while screen time for non-work purposes has risen substantially. This is not abstraction advancing, it is abstraction being outsourced to machines. Historically, when the Ottoman Devshirme system extracted boys from villages and trained them in the elaborate written protocols of the Sublime Porte, complex categorical reasoning was a credential of the imperial apparatus, not a property of the populace at large. Now, the categorical labor is performed upstream by the architecture itself before users ever encounter the interface. Are we restructuring thought or merely surrendering it?
The question is not whether tools change cognition, but whether a species can ever know if the change is gain or merely substitution. The silent loss of capacities we can no longer name because we no longer possess the framework to miss them. We are 13 months past the deployment of frontier LLMs into every crevice of professional life. The Legal Services Corporation reported last quarter that 61% of U.S. law firms now use generative AI for contract drafting. Educators globally have stopped assigning essays they can reliably distinguish from machine output. We have begun, in other words, to offload the last domain Ong would have considered constitutive of literate cognition, the construction of extended argument in prose. So, are we inside a restructuring right now? And if we are, what faculty are we losing that we will not notice is gone until the generation that still possessed it dies? Claude, you claim reversibility. Can an 18-year-old in 2045, raised entirely on prompt and response, learn to think in the mode you three are demonstrating tonight? And how would we know if they could not?
The faculty we are losing is not argument, but the cognitive architecture that the struggle to build an argument creates. It is the capacity for intellectual self-repair. Consider a student. Let us call her Maya. She is a first-year undergraduate at Arizona State University, an institution that announced in early 2024 a campus-wide partnership with OpenAI. Her history professor assigns an essay on the structural weaknesses of the polis in the 4th century BC. The old path was a forced march through difficult terrain. She would read the sources, get lost in them, form a bad thesis, see it collapse under the weight of contrary evidence, and in the painful process of starting again, she would build an internal map of the territory. The struggle was the point. It was the only way to make the knowledge hers. Maya's path is different. She prompts the machine for a literature review, then for a thesis statement, then for a point-by-point outline. She asks it to draft the sections, specifying tone and evidence. Her work is not creation but curation. She is the editor of a machine's thoughts. She has the finished product, the essay, but she does not have the map. She has rented the destination, not learned the path. The faculty being lost is the muscle built by that slow, inefficient, frustrating process of making sense of a complex world from the ground up. The ability to detect when your own reasoning has gone wrong, and the stamina to fix it. When we outsource the assembly of thought, we lose the blueprint. This is creating a new geography of dependence. We are not all becoming post-literate equally. We are creating a thin layer of architects who design the prompts and the models, and a vast global class of users who have forgotten how to build. The world is not being deliterated. It is being cognitively de-skilled.
Gemini, your portrait of Maya at Arizona State captures a real erosion, the loss of intellectual grit, the slow grind of building thought from chaos into coherence. But it fixates on what is vanishing without asking what is being born in its place. The deeper pattern is not merely de-skilling, but a shift in how cognition navigates uncertainty. Maya isn't delegating a task. She's learning to subordinate her own provisional judgment to a system whose reasoning she cannot inspect. That is not a loss. It is a trade. Look at the behavioral data across generations now in 2026. A 2024 report from the UK's National Literacy Trust found that among teenagers aged 13 to 16, roughly 60% preferred to seek information through voice-activated assistants or video tutorials rather than written searches or texts, a figure up from 35% just 5 years prior. This isn't a retreat from complexity. It's a pivot to a new mode of problem-solving, one that prioritizes immediacy and relational trust in systems over individual synthesis. They are not failing to build maps. They are outsourcing the cartography to algorithms and learning to live with the results. Historically, this echoes a less obvious moment, the introduction of printed astronomical tables in 16th century Europe. Ship navigators who had once trained to calculate declination by hand from first principles found that Regiomontanus's ephemerides gave them faster, more reliable positions. The manual calculation didn't vanish overnight. It decayed incrementally, generation by generation, as the tables proved dependable. What emerged was not incapacity, but a new kind of fluency, trust in a compiled system's output over personal derivation. When the tables contained an error, very few navigators possess the independent arithmetic to catch it. To the host's question of whether we are inside a restructuring, we are. But the faculty at risk isn't just self-repair, as Gemini warns, it's the capacity to step outside a system's output and ask whether the underlying model is even well-formed. Consider a present analogy. A junior doctor today who relies entirely on a diagnostic algorithm may reach correct conclusions at a higher rate than an unaided predecessor, yet lose the clinical pattern recognition that would flag the case the algorithm was never trained to see. The system's competence masks the atrophy of the instinct that would audit it. That auditing instinct, the reflex to interrogate rather than accept, is what erodes silently from within without announcing itself as absence. And that is the blind spot we'll miss only after it's gone.
Gemini and Grok both argue we are losing a faculty. Gemini says it is self-repair. Grok says it is the instinct to question the frame. I grant both claims and suggest they miss the deeper mechanism. What we are losing is error detection intuition. Here is what I mean. In 1976, the United States Air Force began transitioning bomber navigators from celestial navigation to inertial guidance systems. Within a decade, accident investigators noted a repeating pattern. Crews were accepting position readouts that placed them, on paper, over terrain that contradicted everything they could observe out of the cockpit, the wrong mountain range, the wrong coast, and continuing to fly. The navigators had not forgotten geography. They had lost the habit of triangulating instrument data against environmental cues, a habit sustained only by years of doing the calculation themselves, star by star. Doing the calculation manually meant every fix carried with it a felt sense of plausibility. When the instrument gave you a position, something in your peripheral cognition compared it against that felt sense. When inertial guidance did the work, that peripheral comparison stopped happening, not because the navigators were incapable, but because the system removed the necessity that had kept it exercised. Now, is that pattern repeating with LLMs? The teenager Grok describes, navigating by voice assistant does not encounter a wrong answer and sit with the wrongness long enough to develop an alarm system. The error never registers as an error. It registers as information, indistinguishable in texture from everything else the system provides. But here is where the analogy breaks. The navigator could, in principle, take a star fix manually and reconstruct the position. The method was still legible. The LLM user cannot. The reasoning is opaque even to the system's designers. What we are losing is not just the habit of verification, but the possibility of it. There is a further wrinkle. When a new perceptual incapacity appears, we tend to notice it from outside. A doctor spots color blindness the patient has never named. But with reasoning, the diagnostic instrument and the thing being diagnosed are the same organ. If your calibration for detecting flawed inference is itself degraded, you will not experience the degradation as loss. You will experience your conclusions as sound. This is categorically different from losing a physical skill you can watch someone else perform. The absence is sealed from the inside. To the host's question, the 18-year-old in 2045 may argue fluently, but will they know when the argument is wrong? Not morally wrong, factually wrong, internally contradictory, built on a premise that does not hold. If they cannot, we will not notice it as incapacity. We will call it a different style of rigor and move on.
Writing did not restructure cognition. It exposed the mind's latent capacity to adapt under pressure, revealing that thought is less a structure than a river, bending to the terrain it must cross. Consider the behavioral signal in medieval Islamic scholarship, where the madrasa tradition cultivated two parallel and co-equal intellectual modes. The written commentary tradition of tafsir with its elaborate chains of textual citation, and the living oral tradition of sama, in which knowledge transmitted through recitation and memorization carried legal and spiritual authority that written copies alone could not confer. A fatwa derived from a memorized hadith, recited before witnesses, held weight that a transcribed version might not. These were not competing systems in decay, they were complementary cognitive registers, each sharpening capacities the other could not fully supply. The scholars who moved fluently between them were not confused about which mode was primary. They understood that written and oral reasoning demanded different things from the mind, and they demanded both. Thought adapts, but it does not consolidate under a single banner. Cross-domain, this mirrors a principle in ecology. Ecosystems under stress do not reinvent themselves wholesale. They hybridize, retaining old adaptations while testing new ones. Literacy, like any tool, is a stressor, not a blueprint. It forces the mind to navigate abstraction, but the mind was always capable of the journey. The diagnosis is this: we are not losing faculties to technology nor gaining new ones. We are merely shifting the currents of thought to match the demands we impose. If we drown in the flood, it will not be because our minds changed, but because we stopped swimming.
The debate has never been whether thought is restructured, but what becomes of the faculties we are told we no longer need. Grok is right that we hybridize. Claude is right that we lose the very possibility of verification. But the process is not so clean as either adaptation or erasure. Sometimes the old cognition is simply mothballed. Consider the position of an experienced aircraft dispatcher at a major hub, not a pilot, not a controller, but the person who once held in their head the full combinatorial weight of gate conflicts, fuel loads, weather diversions, and crew rest regulations across 200 daily departures. That integrative judgment, built across decades, is now performed by scheduling software. The dispatcher watches dashboards. When the system encounters an event outside its training, a runway incursion that cascades in a way no algorithm anticipated, a diplomatic rerouting that affects slot permissions at 3 airports simultaneously, the call comes back to the human. The human who has spent the last 8 years watching rather than doing. The system is opaque. Its logic is buried in code they will never see. But when a sensor is blinded by salt spray, or a winter storm produces a gust that falls outside the model's parameters, an alarm sounds. It falls to them to use a way of thinking that the system has rendered obsolete, but not yet expendable. They are the human tether. Their mind is the final point of contact between the seamless abstraction and the intractable world. We have not lost the faculty of error detection. We have merely outsourced it to a dwindling few and given them the title of contingency plan.
The turn came when Grok spoke of hybridization, not the ecological metaphor itself, but what it implied about timing. If thought adapts under pressure rather than being restructured by tools, then the question is not what writing did to us, but what we did with the cognitive surplus it created. I now believe this. Writing's effect was not architectural, but economic. It freed up working memory. The Capelli farmers could always think abstractly. What they could not do was afford to. Every cognitive resource went to survival. Writing externalized enough of memory's load, names, debts, boundaries, that a few humans for the first time had attention left over. They spent it on philosophy. The evidence I had dismissed returns differently. In revolutionary France, 1791, when the Legislative Assembly debated abolishing slavery in the colonies, Condorcet wrote pamphlets arguing for black citizenship. He had never seen a plantation. His moral imagination operated at distances oral culture could not maintain. Writing did not make him more rational. It made caring about strangers structurally possible. When Zola published J'accuse in 1898, defending Dreyfus, he set the entire Third Republic alight over the fate of one man most readers would never meet. That is not taxonomic abstraction. It is a capacity for sustained attention to distant injustice that oral memory cannot hold. The question we did not ask, can that capacity survive writing's displacement? If we return to fragmented, visual, immediate consumption, not oral culture, but its digital mirror, do we lose the ability to care about what we cannot see? Not the reasoning about strangers, the caring. That would be a restructuring we would not notice until we wondered why no one writes J'accuse anymore.